My name's Ben Cleveland. I am going to take over from Wes for a little while as host. Thanks, Wes. I work here with Learn. I'm also working with the E21LE project, and I do know many of you. I'll introduce firstly Peter Jamieson, who is professor here at the university, works in the Office of the Provost, and has a strategic role in campus development and overseeing many of the design projects that do go on at the university, with a very much an eye to what impacts they might have on teaching and learning across the campus. He works also in many instances overseas, Peter, and in other universities across the country, and he's been doing this and it's much sought after in many, many places. We'll hear from Peter. We'll keep moving. I'll introduce Terry Byers. Terry is the Director of Innovation in Teaching and Learning at Churchy Grammar School in Brisbane. He's also, and I'm not hoping I'm embarrassing you here, Terry, Microsoft Teacher of the Year 2014 for Australia, and recently was at a conference in Barcelona, which we're all very jealous of. Had quite an intense but wonderful experience over there a few weeks ago, so he's been well travelled over recent weeks. Terry's paper today is titled Measuring the Empirical Effect of Learning Spaces on Teaching and Learning Through a Quasi-Experimental Approach, an Alternative to Traditional Post-Occupancy Evaluation. And he has started his PhD, but he's also working within the E21LE project, and we're very happy to have him. Over to you, Terry.
Is that okay?
Say how you want to do it.
Can I just get the blue screen? Is it?
That's at the laptop.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for that, Ben. What I'll just quickly do is just to give you a background to my work at Churchy. Basically, over the last 3 years, I've been working quite closely with Wes Innes, and what we've been doing, very small studies, one after the other, is basically generating an argument for changing our learning spaces to facilitate not only our technology-enabled learning spaces that we now have, but also pedagogical change. The big driver for our school is academic learning outcomes. We have various KPIs that we must hit each year. A lot of our students go to UQ and study medicine and law, so we have fairly high expectations of where our students will go, and we have to meet those expectations. So what we've started to do is to generate the empirical evidence to take to not only our teachers, but our parents and our key stakeholders, which are our board, to basically argue why we should change a 100-year-old classroom. And at Churchy, they are all nearly 100 years old. They're very traditional in layout. They were very traditional in operation. And under the DER from the previous federal government, our school runs 1,800 machines. Every kid in the school has one. And basically what we saw after the first year or two of one-to-one with a tablet PC was we weren't seeing anything that was tangible in terms of change. If anything, we actually saw retreat. We saw our staff retreat back to the front of the room, retreat back to very didactic pedagogy, and unfortunately we were starting to get a lot of pressure to provide the evidence that all the money that the school had invested through the key stakeholders actually worked. In a previous life, I was an organic chemist. So my role was to design drugs, good drugs, not naughty drugs, but drugs that actually determine an effect. And an approach that we used to use a lot is quasi-experimental, where basically you have a placebo, you have an intervention, and your aim is to show that there's been an effect. So Wes and I have been working on the long-term project where we do what we call interventions. So we might pick 6 classrooms if we go back to 2012, and what we might do is we might just change the classroom. We might just change how the space is arranged with 6 classes, with 12 teachers, and maybe 180 students. And what we do is we actually look at how that change has affected a number of different domains, namely their student engagement and their learning outcomes. So what a quasi-experimental is very different. Unlike post-occupancy, which is where you examine after the effect, what we actually do is we get in early. We establish a baseline. So before we make any change, we start to see how the students are operating, what's their level of engagement, how they view their teachers' practice, and most importantly, their learning outcomes. Then, because we focus on the class becomes the unit of analysis, we then track them post the intervention. And what we're looking for is if that intervention alone, one variable, has made any effect. We only ever change one because we've learnt from the mistakes of probably the MIT experiment where they changed everything. So in the Teal experiment, they changed the teachers, they changed the assessment, they changed the curriculum, they changed the pedagogy, they changed everything, and then they associated the effect to the change in space. Whereas what we've looked at is the work that's been done by Brooks at the University of Minnesota, where they just do one thing at a time, examine that effect, and see if there's any quantifiable effect. The big thing is also we're after causal relationships. Now, I like causality. Causality works and resonates for me as a quantitative researcher. Obviously, causality is a very hard thing to determine, and we try to do the best we can within the nuances of a schooling environment. So, we look at the variables. The variables are a massive theme for my methodology. The unit of analysis is a class. It can't be the individual, because as an emic researcher, it won't get past ethics if I know who the individual kids are. So the unit of analysis becomes a class, and we track the class as a group. We then look at such an independent variable, such as changing the space. So back in 2012, we picked 6 classrooms and we changed them. I didn't help any teachers, didn't provide any PD, I didn't talk to them, I didn't help them, I just let them loose. And what we wanted to see is how the effect in space changed how the students viewed their technology, which was pretty bad at that point in time. You think you give every kid in the class a really good machine, and a lot of them didn't like it. A lot of them were really rebelling against it. They thought, you know, you're giving me a particular machine that I don't particularly like, why should I use it? We started to look at engagement and learning outcomes. Now, the big variables that we're after is confounding variables. So we had to control the teacher. The most important variable in any change is the teacher. So by keeping the teacher the same, we enable that variable to be controlled. Cognitive ability. So if I pick class A versus class B, now what if class A is streamed? What if class B is mixed? And we compare and contrast their learning outcomes. But if you control the class and the class becomes unit of analysis, you're actually controlling not only the students' cognitive ability, but the class composition, the groupings, the subjects, and everything. So basically, what we try to moderate is those confounding variables, because they can and will affect the learning outcomes at the end. So what we do is we apply a single subject research design. Now, it does come from the health sciences, where you would have a placebo. So we get a problem, we look at a placebo treatment, we establish a baseline of non-treatment, we have an intervention, and then we measure the impact. Now, in most cases, they use visual analysis, but we do more. We do much more quantifiable, empirical-based study, because visual analysis can be a bit subjective. If we look at internal validity, so you've got between subject. Because the class becomes a unit of analysis, you're not comparing class against class, you're comparing the class against themselves. Also within subject variability, the fact is that you're keeping all the kids together all the way through the study. So if they change, it's the kids that change. It's not anything around them in terms of you're trying to mitigate those effects. And the maturation is important. Yes, you have to do a longitudinal study. Yes, over time kids get smarter, you hope. But maturation is that we have cognitive ability standardised for every student in our school. So we moderate that And what we're trying to do is to isolate the effect of the intervention. So this is an example of what it looks like after the analysis. So what you actually see here is we were able to do the holy grail of single subject research design, which was to have a baseline, to try an intervention, and then to pull those kids out of the intervention and put them in their old classroom. What we did with this study is we looked at primary school students. So they were in there, one teacher, one classroom. They went to a new space, and then they went back. Now the new space and their normal classroom were the same size, they just had different physical layouts. And what we started to see here was, in terms of these kids don't know, in terms of the questions, what we're asking them about collaborative learning. So we asked them, what are the instances of collaborative learning? How often do you learn it? What was interesting is most of the time it's very hard to do the withdrawal again, but it's interesting to see how the kids view their learning when their environment changes back to their old style. So what we do is we do a repeated measures survey. We have a high retention rate. We try to aim for about 95% plus in terms of retention rate for our surveys. If we do have missing data, we use maximum likelihood estimation, which is a complicated algorithm. But what it does is it looks at all the data, goes back in time, and tries to predict what the data would be for those 1 or 2 kids who may have missed the survey. Then we use conjugats, where we look at reliability within the item. The aim is to get 0.8. Most of the time, we get about 0.9. So what we're looking for there is the reliable item, and then we look at learning outcomes versus cognitive ability. So this is what it looks like. So visual analysis with class means and 95% confidence intervals. So you can see if we just do an A-B intervention where we've got the baseline, which is A on the left, and the intervention is on the right. So what we're looking for is the reason why we use confidence intervals is it shows us trend, shows us variability, and it shows us the sequence over time. And what we're after is for those confidence intervals to not overlap. So if they don't have overlap, by visual analysis, that's a statistically significant effect. So you can see here, that's what we would be after in terms of measuring the effect of space. That's not enough. I go a bit further. What we do next is I use Cohen's D for effect size. So what we do is we look at methods that are again applied in the health sciences, and we try to find the effect size using Cohen's all the way through. And that's basically, you can look at our learning outcomes, our data versus our Cohen's D. So we're getting very large effect sizes. What it tells us is, in terms of this, whereas this would be a non-statistically significant effect. Even though the levels don't overlap, the fact is that you've got a positive trend. So therefore, we determine that as a non-statistically significant effect, even though the effect size is over 1. Then we look at learning outcomes.
And you're wrapping up now?
Wrapping up, yeah, go real quick. Again, we do pair t-tests, and the last bit of data that we look at is in terms of moderating those students in the new space versus those students, their peers of like ability in their old space. The black line are those students in the new space relative to their cognitive ability outperforming their students in a traditional learning environment. We take this to our staff, we basically say this is the effective space, and over time the evidence has actually engendered our staff to accept the change, and now we're gradually winning the war. And it's amazing if you bring in hard data, people can't argue with it. And that's been a critical moment for us in our school. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks very much, Terry. One of the things I neglected to say at the beginning was that this phase of the day is looking at, as written here in the program, emerging methods in learning environment evaluation. You can see obviously Terry's study fits very much into that methods issue. Our next speaker is Anna Sala Oviedo. Anna is also working within the E21LE project on a PhD. She's director of the learning environments consultancy firm called New Learning Environments Derivative Research, and her paper is titled The Use and Development of the Learning Environments Analysis. Ooh, thanks so much.
Sorry, Ben, Nana, before you do that, just before these get cold, those that asked for coffee runs, we've got long blacks Football latte.
Short walk.
Thanks, Heather.
Anybody else have a latte? Yeah?
All good.
I'm good. As Ben said, I am part of the evaluation of the learning environment program, and I'm just starting to my PhD project, and really enjoy having the time to talk and think about all these issues and how to evaluate an effective learning environment. This is a bit of a look into the past and then taking it into the future. We developed the learning environment analysis tool. Which is on. Okay. It was initially developed to support the Victorian Education Department's Broadmeadows Schools Regeneration project. Through this project, 17 schools were going to be merged into 10, and 7 new campuses were going to be constructed. The regeneration project emerged in about 2004 and was formally constituted by the state government in 2006. And our project started in 2009, more or less. And it was set up to comprehensively address what had come to be identified as systemic local education failure. So it was an idea of regenerating the region by means of education. It aimed to do so through a combination of institutional restructuring, ongoing leadership and staff professional development, curriculum and teaching reinvigoration, the infrastructure investment, and also the community engagement. So it was a holistic approach to that reinvigoration of the zones. It was not just one thing or just fixing it all. It had to come with several other things around it. LEAD was designed as a reflective tool, so it was intended to help learning communities, that was the leaders, the teachers, and the students mainly, reflect on the implementation of changes to educational programs, the pedagogical practice, and the use of the physical space. So it was intended to be a formative evaluation tool and a tool for discussion. The outcomes were expected to identify successes and failures in the design of the learning spaces and examine the gaps and identify possible solutions. Also, to identify how effectively the learning environments were aligning and were being used and understand the problem areas, and determine also the teachers' special competencies and identify areas that could be good to have a bit more professional development on in terms of that alignment between teachers' practice and the space where they were practicing. And then with those 3 outcomes, provide guidance into the learning communities on any new learning environments that they might envision, or refurbishments or changes. It also has proven to be a very good tool for the learning communities to use and determine where they are in terms of that thinking about how space and influence the pedagogy practice, and also enable an internal discussion in those communities to articulate a way forward that is common for all of them. So this is an example of some of the results. At the moment, LEAD is accessible online and provides outcomes through a range of graphs, such as this one. This one, for example, shows a bit of misalignment between how people feel in terms of being able to change their space. Autonomy mostly. I guess it's sort of confident but also conflicted. So this, for example, we get the results live, and then we can talk with the learning community. Imagine it's you, you would do the survey, that would come up immediately almost, and then we could talk about it. Okay, why do you think this is happening? What can you do about it? And so on. other results show, for example, a misalignment maybe in what their opinion is about the importance of some factors in contemporary learning and where the school is. And maybe, for example, in informal and social days, a bit of misalignment. So we identify a gap that maybe we need to address with a new learning environment that we want to create. The tool also gives more visual messages that can be conveyed with the community, and this has also proven to be quite important and useful. The tool was initially developed using the Victorian principles of learning and teaching, the E5 instructional model, and the Victorian session learning standards as frameworks. And then also we looked at a number of existing evaluation tools as reference. And then looking at those tools gave us the many gaps in the ability to actually detect pedagogy and space weaknesses on alignment. So there was lots of tools to evaluate comfort, things like that, not so much about how the intended educational outcomes or delivery methods were aligned with the students. So the application of the four events and the E5 was chosen as distinctly Victorian frameworks for the school would immediately recognize. So these areas. But also because they have made in their own right. So Victoria is being one of the best educational policy makers in Australia, we think. So it had a lot of value, and they were very well researched frameworks to work with. So the principles of learning and teaching, for example, are about the learning environment being supportive, promoting independence. A learning environment is seen here not as a physical learning environment, but as a more greater idea of what the learning environment is. Also, being more personalized to the students' needs and a challenging environment. Talks about assessment practices and how to connect with the community. The E5 is an instructional model that tries to define effective teacher practice. This is really tricky. It is mostly directed to the sciences, and it will assist every teacher every day in every classroom to know what high quality practice looks like. Maybe. So it has 5 phases, and they are around 5 active verbs: engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. And there is a level of competency for each, and a guide on what the requirements are in order to move from one level of competency or profile statement into the next. So what we did is to use those profile statements and translate them into what would they mean in terms of space and in terms of the teacher's ability to change space. So each of the E5 domains and levels become more advanced. So it's the teacher's understanding and command of the space should also be more advanced. So for example, in level 4, would indicate a sound understanding on how space affects students, and the teacher would also be able to rely on students' feedback to reconfigure or alter space. So we did a similar manner in analyzing the whole framework to further regroup the principles into 4 categories, and then that could be used to evaluate learning environments in the different phases of the design. So the categories are well-being, student engagement and support, learning for life, and global impact. Phase 1 is pre-design or concept design and evaluation of the existing facilities, and addresses the questions of what is effective and what is important. Phase 2 relates to the design process and addresses the questions how will it be used and how will it work. And then phase 3 is post-occupancy evaluation and addresses the questions and is it sufficient, which is very similar to the phase 1. From all of these and other frameworks, we came up with the current version of LEAD, which has been translated into a survey type tool, which is the tool I was explaining. And the analysis of LEAD or evaluation doesn't focus on the issues alone, but also on the human element of the design, including the students and teachers' interactions and experiences, as well as the way teaching and learning is provided and how well the physical spaces are able to support the learning community and imperatives. And at the moment, LEAD achieves this by providing a framework to evaluate the responsiveness of the learning environment to the learners, to the learning community, and then it's about the learning environment as well. It can be applied in the different phases of the design process, always assuming there is a context. We need sometimes to work with them on establishing what that context is, the vision, and so on. And then also phase 3 eventually gives us lots of hints on how to do professional learning for the users. As it evolves, the tool has been further developed to be flexible enough to adapt a range of different administrative, cultural, and physical contexts beyond the broad meadows and Victorian context, including tertiary institution and workspace, and also has been used by different users such as students, parents, administrative staff, and so on.
You might have to get your spouses in soon.
So the PhD study and the ASD grant, LEAD is being reviewed, tested, and refined. So a key objective is to improve the rigor of the tool so that it can be used as an effective evaluation and research tool. And a range of theories and philosophical frameworks are currently being explored to achieve this goal. So these are some of the themes loosely that I am looking at. And this is still very much a work in progress. So I want to show you, for example, this is my current diagram thinking about the idea of place. And it's interesting because I'm also looking now at assemblage theory, which is something that Chris was mentioning, assemblage as well. And the idea of place of power and relationships. So we hope that monitoring and improving upon LEAD outcomes will not only help individual learning communities operate more effectively and influence any future built environment, learning, indoors and outdoors, but also by being able to rigorously compare results across different communities, it will provide guidance for future capital works.
Thanks, Anne. We actually had Wes together and I walked into our E21LE space the other day. He just sent us this, and there was this amazing diagram on the whiteboard, and we thought, oh, we've seen that somewhere. And it's great thinking that Anna does in visual. The third speaker in this session about emerging methods is Graham Oliver. Again, Graham's working in the E21LE project, doing his Doctorate of Education. Graham was one of the foundation leadership team at the Australian School of Science and Maths, which will be familiar to many of you. Celebrated its 10th year last year, is that right, Graham? Last year, and can be viewed perhaps as a tipping point in the architectural design of schools, not only in Australia but across the world. And I think I'll just leave it there. Graham, over to you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Ben. I'm actually in the very early days of my engagement with my research, so I feel quite privileged to be here in this august company. And I'll share ideas really are still exploratory for me, and then very keen to get feedback and comment on that as they help me shape the true research area I'm going into and how I'll shape that research. Magic buttons, going this way. All right, this is the broad, simple map of the world we're working with, isn't it? You know, we've got extensive work in post-occupancy evaluation, connecting it with build projects, and so there's a loop there. Early evaluation, feedback, improvement. We've mentioned though, how do we connect pedagogy and learning into that area? And that's the broad field that the whole E21 Learning Virus project is trying to look at. Anna gave her demonstration of how she's really building a rich and enriched connection in that POE field projects link and bringing the connection with learning into it. Terry gave his example of how you can build rich data in the pedagogy and learning connection area and therefore build up a greater body of knowledge in this field. But there are still some issues to deal with. It's great to hear David probably sum up my whole of education in one phrase, to speak from an architect's point of view. A few minutes ago, we don't have an enormous amount to do with pedagogy. Okay, so that's the gap we're trying to work with. We've got the field behind us. I don't want to dwell on that now. I'll go to where we want to be moving. There have been 5 major projects in Australia about new building environments, especially the tertiary sector, ILT, learning and teaching, or ARC projects over the last 7 or 8 years. Have we got a great body of knowledge out of that? They all have tended to come to one major point in their conclusions, and it's probably summed up in this one from Kay Suter, the Latrobe University-led project for Next Generation Learning Environments. There's an extensive expanding literature of teaching, learning and knowledge generation, extensive body of work exploring physical and technological environments and systems of learning and teaching, but work intersecting the two is not common and not well understood. So that's the patch I'm trying to get into and investigate. Jill Blackmore out of Deakin University, through her review work, put it in these ways. Overall, there's an inability of the various research paradigms to talk with and learn from each other, even though all were concerned about improving student learning. A way of putting a dimension to that, look at, say, architectural evaluation, a Google search, 1.7 million items come up. Look at education evaluation, Google search, 3.3 million items come up. There's a lot there, hey, that we've seen, but are they getting together? Well, critical issue. What else? Evaluations of learning spaces have been limited in depth, rigour and theoretical grounding. Theoretical grounding for the ongoing connection of the evaluations is important and heavily reliant on informal or anecdotal evidence. And so it seems that every time people go into this space, they reinvent the way they're going to do it. The criteria for evaluation are consistent and clear beforehand, and so it's the anecdotes afterwards. And in that context, there's a very strong inclination to self-justifying evaluations. Once you've spent somewhere between $40,000 or $40 million on a project, you're not going to look at it yourself and say, hey, we got it wrong. So there's a problem of rigour, therefore, in the approach. Ken Fisher, Ken's still with us. Yes, Ken, did you coin the term or use it in that 10 years ago, brought the term deep spatial silence out in an article Ken presented there? And that resonates with me about what we're trying to address. How do we open up this area of silence around space, the connection between space and teaching and learning? And added to it, with his work with Ben Cleveland, published last year, that gaps in the evaluative approaches and for the evaluation of physical learning environments from a more rigorous pedagogical perspective. But what does that pedagogical perspective mean? Okay, we've got the old diagram. How do we fit the pedagogical perspective in there? What are the dimensions of that pedagogical perspective? So go a bit further. Again, from Matthew's work, so this is University of Queensland now, is it? Evaluation framework lacking, but what is interesting is the second statement. They're attempting to determine the impact of spaces is difficult given the multitude of factors that influence student learning and their experiences from teaching methods. So that's the area that Terry is working diligently to control in one specific study. Can we get broader sets of data connected to this critical issue? How do we do that? Then I thought, well, is it all worth it? If I go back to John Hattie's work, and he tells me that, hey, the physical school is only having a 5% impact on learning anyhow, but what we all here are passionate about is just that bit. Is it worth it? And in fact, it's even worse, say, if you dig into Hattie's work, he says the school actually includes the financial management of the school, the culture of the school, and the physical space of the school. And in his breakdown of data, the school has an effect size of minus 0.5%. So is this worth anything at all to us? So we've got to keep investigating that area. Unduly happy.
I'll comment on that later.
What comes out of that is, if we're looking at the student experience in some way, what do we mean by the student experience? And we need to be able to determine the dimensions and measure that. Hattie, in his measurement, was looking at student achievement. And quite specific measures of student achievement we can show and affect sizing. So that's one aspect. But the work from that Matthews had done at Queensland University was actually looking at student experience and using surveys like the student satisfaction and engagement survey to gather their data. So we now have an issue. What do we want to measure if that's the case? We're into this field. What are the critical things we want to measure? But there's the other dimension in there we want to bring into the field, and again from Ben Cleveland and Ken Fisher, my italics there. The new buildings are intended to support contemporary approaches to teaching and learning. There's an exhortation. We want new approaches to teaching and learning from these buildings. Well, are we getting it? We'll go here. Now, you've probably got a field that looks more like this. The original post-occupancy evaluation, you've got a building, you've got that figure back into itself, and now we're bringing in the dimensions of contemporary teaching, we want, and student experience. How are we going to bring all of those matters together in the measure we want to engage with? Blackmore, again, put it this way, systematic reform imperatives that change practices and student responses to improve learning outcomes. But the complexity of the strand could be investigated this way. Is it possible to measure effect size of physical learning environments on changing teaching practices? Terry, getting close to doing it. Yes? All right. Can we measure effect size of physical learning environments on improved student learning outcomes? I can't find an exact measure of that anywhere yet. And can we make this data meaningful back into the build process? Now, we'll put on that a little bit because the effect size of physical learning environments on changing teaching practice. Part of it is why. There's an expectation for change. How do teachers change? What will change professional practice? I looked at the work of Hargraves and Fulham, presenting models of professional practice, an ideal model in building professional capital. If you want to build professional capital according to Hargraves and Fulham, physical learning environment has nothing to do with it. Not mentioned anywhere. If we want to build professional capital according to AITS and teaching standards, learning environment, teachers don't have to do anything to engage with their learning environment. So there's the silence, spatial silence in those areas. How do we engage in that discussion about learning environment, connecting with pedagogy, connecting with learning outcomes, and therefore the cycle of the process being iterative and continuing to build. So I'll skip to that and go to the intentions for investigating that at the moment. And it'll be possibly through three layers. One is to establish the connections and understandings in a way that the conversation, dialogue can be meaningfully connected, not just across the fields of architecture and education, but others that have an impact, but also within education, because there's great diversity there. The method that we're exploring for doing that is expert elicitation. We actually go to the experts to bring out from them what are the understandings that they want to inform this particular part of the dialogue. Reconfigure, not by determining a paradigm, but by, in a sense, co-constructing the framework we want to use for the investigation. Next, then we've got to test that. When we've got that framework developed, we're having the dialogue, is it a meaningful one in terms of effect? And we'll look at matching it against some effect size measures to see if that works. And then the third part of that is, can we make that a useful tool for people to work with? And I've got my notion there of something like a pedagogic positioning tool that helps people work their way through this concept in their own build, development, and implementation projects.
Thank you, Graham. Now, at this point, we will go to Mr. Peter Jamison, who will help facilitate the discussion. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Sorry, before you start, the camera would like you in front of the wall rather than in front of the window. Apparently, we can't see people. Oh, yeah, you just do it. Sorry,
Probably glare, there's a glare.
Yeah, one of the good things about this job is you get to ask at least a question and not wait for somebody else to take a hand. So I'd like to make this a bit more question and answer and conversation if we can for the next 20 minutes. But I want to start with a question or two to each of the presenters so we get the ball rolling. I'm conscious that several people said that they're new or beginning researchers, and there are probably others in the room in that position. So my question to Terry, wherever he is, hi Terry, good to see you again. My question to you is, as I listen to you describe your methodology, it's mind-bogglingly difficult for me to get my head around. It's just completely opposite to what I did as a researcher. Okay? So I know that new researchers often turn to people who've been working in the field. So somebody's likely to turn to your study when you finished it and say, there's some interesting outcomes. My question is, how easily would it be for someone to reproduce that sort of methodology? What sort of background would someone need to have to come along and reproduce that kind of study? Because I don't understand that.
So basically, do you want me to set up? Okay. I'm what you would call a pragmatic researcher. I'm not particularly bent on a particular method. I find the best method to suit my context, my students, my teachers, and I make it work. So what we've done is we've looked at really basic tools. We've actually taken other people's surveys that have been tested and tried and true. They're what we use to inform our student attitudinal surveys. So what we do is we adapt that to our context. We pilot test with our kids. We make sure that the grammar and they understand the comprehension. And all it is basically is the serendipitous nature of being able to get a good baseline, being able to get in there and actually look at controlling your variables with a good baseline, doing your intervention within the confines of the schooling day experience, etc. And that's really difficult.
And so if I can throw back a quote to you that you said. You said that if you bring in the hard data, people can't argue with it. So are you expecting at the end of your study, when you've got some conclusive things to present to us, that no one's going to come along and argue with it?
Oh, people argue. People argue. Basically, in terms of my staff, they are the best audience because they ask the hardest questions. What I wanted to do is to show people that learning spaces were important. And the only way I could show that was actually bringing my old department. I was the head of mathematics for a number of years, and I had people who've been teaching at Churchy longer than I'd been alive. I have a staff member who's taught in the same classroom for 35 years. So the only way I can bring him along is to show him that it does have a positive effect. By showing them the data and bringing them along the journey, we're actually chipping away, more broadly speaking, at their professional practice. But showing the evidence has been really important for our staff to see, oh, it does have an impact. What people will then say is they'll say, but what, or but if. But by showing them the hard numbers, they can't say it's your perception, Terry. It's the perception of the students and the hard data of their learning outcomes. So we've taken away those other easier questions.
Thanks, Terry. And I will begin the whole thing with a question or two for each of the presenters and then open it up. Anna, I know Anna's, sorry Anna, thanks. Again, you might want to come at the front just to give you a chance to speak back to yours. You described your evaluation tool, which is a very different way of going about it to Terry's. And you also described it in the context of a very collaborative process. You used the phrase learning communities, and you described the components of that. What sense of ownership does the community that you work with have of the evaluation tool? Who owns the evaluation tool? Can the community own it?
At the moment, yes. So we have not had an instance where we haven't had to tweak the evaluation tool to a certain extent to match the community's context and needs. And sometimes it has been a really positive contribution to make the tool better. Sometimes it has been, especially in tertiary institutions, sometimes a little bit political, like they don't want teachers to answer with a certain question that might be controversial and might challenge the success of the whole project, in their opinion, things like that.
How do you deal with that? In terms of you being a researcher or you being an expert in the field with a lot of knowledge about this, how do you deal with somebody, a client, so it's a commercial relationship, who says, frankly, we want that question eliminated, that's controversial, we don't want that to be raised. Can you straddle that fence?
Well, at the moment, with the evidence we have in that question is relevant and really important to the success of the survey, and we try to convince them. But as I said, it wasn't developed to be a very, very rigorous research tool. So we don't have that hard data that Terry was mentioning to say, this is why, and these are the outcomes that you would expect because it's so well already finished and rounded. So sometimes it's a communication thing. Also, the purpose hasn't been in these instances so much to get sound research, but maybe to get a bit of a perception of where the community is and where they want to go and establish that dialogue.
Can it be controversial or compromised in any way the role that you have in terms of trying to get to the, dare I use the word truth, or a better understanding, a deeper understanding of the thing that you're applying a tool to, and the manipulation that might come in by somebody who is the person who's paying their bills, you know, whether it's the head of the school or the learning community or something like that, who simply just doesn't want a door open that might lead to a controversial discussion or issues.
I think that's the reason why we suggested to use the tool for the grant, because then we take that away. It is a research tool only, so then there is those personal implications are no longer valid, I guess, and we have to find a way through ethics and so on to be able to use it rigorously as a research tool without interventions from the, or not some. In a more collaborative process, I cannot imagine how we cannot have to modify it to a certain degree for its context, but in a much more controlled manner. I hope.
Thank you. And just my opening comment or question to Graham. Sorry, everyone's been hiding. Graham, towards the end of your presentation, you said, and this is a quote, you asked the question, what do we want to measure? In that context, I would like you to expand for us on your sense of what you understand the term student experience to mean. It's a term that gets thrown around this university, for instance, readily. There's about 1,000 different interpretations, almost all institutionally defined and conveniently shaped by the institution for its particular purposes.
And that's the critical issues. People determine, shape their own areas there. So there are two factors that we need to consider. There are some measures about student engagement and student satisfaction, both in the university and the school sector. But again, not necessarily widely used and not widely used for comparative data sets. But around that, there's another issue, because the intention of going to a new learning environment often has implicit new learning experiences. So when you've got your measure of experience in one context, is it comparable with the measure of learning experience in another context? And so there's another connection that has to be mapped, has to be plotted. Again, there's very little work in that field. So it's an issue, and what's behind my thinking about issues, while those issues exist, people then can, in a sense, put some blame, some other extraneous factor, and not continue to make connections that they intend to make in the first place. So I'm trying to narrow the field of those extraneous factors in a way to help make those connections. But as Blake said, they're not linear and they're not simple, but try to develop a map. In fact, what Hannah shows her map looks at a map of understanding conceptual connections in physical space, maybe a bit of conceptual connections in learning space, and have a way of aligning, sliding those two maps together to help people identify their locations and therefore their intended next steps, their pathways. That's a facilitative tool in that sense.
Okay, thank you. That's terrific. Thanks to everybody for those initial responses. I'd like to give everybody else in the room a chance to ask questions or engage in conversation now. We've heard from each of the presenters.
Now, I'd like to ask you a question. In your three research questions, the first one is about how teachers change their activities as a result of a change in the space. That's fairly passive and adaptive. Why wouldn't you also be interested in how you change teachers' professional knowledge and what they can do to actually adapt to a space in a sort of proactive fashion, because teachers' professional learning is we don't have a large effect size,
Yeah.
whereas what we know is if teachers don't change what they, or if we can't change in teachers what they know, then you can do nothing much happens.
That's right, but I wanted that question to focus on that issue of the spatial silence at the moment, so as to focus on that. I don't know if it's a workable question.
Yeah.
It's just there more as a straw man question on space learning.
Well, just a comment. I don't know whether Steve's been introduced in this one. Stephen's one of the ARC chief investigators, and Stephen has a strong association with John Hattie. Has a strong association with John Hattie. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but John, that his research did show that. The comment earlier is -0.05%. But in some respects, his research about his meta-analysis about what is being researched. So if it wasn't being researched, then it wasn't important. So partly it's because there's not much there of any use. The speaker is well, I'll shut up for a second. But John has come round through some conversations with us and in our research centre to the extent that we've got drafted another ARC that gives, which is from K to 12. So that intersects with E21LE, which is Years 10, 11, 12 for undergraduate uni. So these two will intersect, and John will hopefully be part of that gig. So he has come round, and he's interested in teacher performance. I think that's so how does the learning environment impact on teacher behaviour, teacher performance? Is the thrust, I think, Wes here. Just step out. That's sort of the thrust of the session. So sorry.
John also made a comment that that data gives an insight into what we want to investigate. Why that was probably likely became as a result is that learning environment is great because there was no differentiation in the learning environment. When every classroom was the same, then it had no response effect. Yeah. And the small negative effect was maybe just one or two bad builds that got a response. Yeah. Now we have differentiated learning environments, and we therefore want to be able to make the measures that highlight differentiated learning environments and therefore the effects that can be associated with them.
Other questions or comments? Sorry, someone back to your hand.
Yeah, I'm interested in Terry. You said that you changed the one variable to move class into a...
No, they stayed in the same classroom. Where possible, we changed the classroom around them. So they went to the same classroom at the same period of the same day. So we changed the class around them.
And so what changed?
So what we did was we used a lot of Peter Lippman's work where we're pushing to a polycentric layout where we're trying to remove the front of the room. So what we did was we just did minor refurbishments to the space. My big aim was to move the teachers away from the front of the room to actually get a more collaborative, engaging space. And what we've found is by making those minor changes, the teachers' pedagogy freed up.
So that was my next question.
Yes.
What in terms of teacher preparation, can you just change the layout of the space and leave all the other things alone and expect any?
Yeah, so what we did with the first stage is there was no evidence in a secondary school context from my research to say, if you change the space, this is what you get. There's lots of stuff in the university sector, but what I wanted to do is to show people that if we actually had a different learning environment, that there would be some effect. To create, we call it making the case for space, making the case for the change. In subsequent studies, we've focused on the teacher, because what we actually found from the first stage is why can a teacher, A, with class A, why can they improve their learning? We had one class improve their learning outcomes by a whole grade and a half. Why can they, when you have teacher B with class B, roughly same cognitive ability, same performance on that plan, roughly same start, why did they only improve by 5%? Why? Because teacher A decided to have a good crack at it, changed their practice, worked a bit differently, whereas this person over here, they just did the same. So we actually, in subsequent stages, we're actually getting into what did this teacher do that elicited this effect versus what did this teacher not do and what did that elicit. So we're trying to get into more focused aspects of practice.
Can I just continue on this query? Well, what were the actual we just talking about table layout?
No, so we kept the desks.
Yeah.
Most of our refurbishments cost about $6,000 to $8,000. Basically, we chucked the teacher desk out into the rubbish bin. We basically forced them to teach from the middle or back. We created a polycentric layout, so basically every wall became the front of the room. So there was no more defined front of the room. We created multiple points of foci through TVs or whiteboards. And basically, any desks that were in rows, we pushed them into groups, and we also established height within the space. So actually creating informal learning spaces within 8x8 classroom. So that's what we did. And what we found was the teachers who performed the best used a combination of chalk and talk, because I'm very mindful of my esteemed colleague next to me who consistently says you can't say that chalk and talk is bad, because chalk and talk is effective for a particular purpose. What we started to see is teachers use a particular pedagogical approach to suit a particular context, and then they would use the technology as a facilitating tool. So what we saw was teachers who would teach maybe might start at 10% direct instruction, but then they'd move to the centre of the room, more collaborative, more differentiation, more difference. Whereas what we saw with some teachers, they just did the same time. They would move their little, we chucked their teacher desk and created a raised, like not a raised podium, but a flexible desk with a stool, a very uncomfortable stool, so they wouldn't sit down. Because I wanted them to be mobile and tactile. And what we actually found was their boys weren't as engaged, whereas the boys who are up, who are writing on the walls, who, we were eliciting different things. And the boys, what we saw there was the effect size in terms of the visual analysis corresponded with their learning outcomes. So we actually saw student attitudinal survey match their learning results. And in subsequent stages, we actually went in and I timed what teachers did. So we defined what were the 5 or 6 quality pedagogical things that we're after, and we timed and looked at groupings and practice and app software and see what was doing, and then match that against learning outcomes and saw if there was a recipe, what worked, what didn't work, and that helps teachers.
On time.
Yep.
The issue of time. My question is to the 3 presenters, and for anybody else in the audience who wants to respond, but you've all described very different approaches to a research method at the various stages of development, obviously. They're addressing the issue of space, environment, place, combinations of those terms have been used repeatedly today. I'm curious to know whether the 3 of you engage with the issue of time, because it strikes me that that's the most complex and most important issue in all of this, and no one wants to talk about it in the way that we didn't talk about space 10 years ago, as Ken was saying. So I'm just curious, has the issue of time been of critical importance in the way the 3 of you conceived of your studies, despite the fact that at different stages of progress? Is that Anna's down there? And, no, I'm not spraying there. So the 3 of you, but please jump in if you can. It's out of the blue. No, it's not. It's a question without notice, but it's a really important issue to me.
My answer to that is, I'll try to find the answer. Through the process of external citations, I'll go to people like you and say, what are the issues, what are the issues? Then do a valuing of that around the field and say, right, this now generally describes the field that I think I want to most investigate. So it won't be taking the comment, we'll be trying to value the breadth of that field through that process. At the moment, it should be something that's there for investigation, but it's the process that will determine where it fits in the field.
Yes, and my comment to you is that experience takes place in a physical location and time.
Yeah.
You can't have experience without either of those things, I wouldn't have thought. I'm just curious to get you thinking about it.
I would say it would fit in the field somewhere, but I won't give that a value yet.
Yes, no, that's good. And I didn't expect you to, but I'm interested in you thinking about it. And has that been a factor for you in your study?
So I have encountered it recently through looking at experience, existence, and education together, and how then a place could be a space of being or of becoming. And so it's a bit even more in the philosophical side of things that I'm looking at. But I think it is really important for, as you are saying. So it went from high level in my case to the rest and what and looking at what time means and how I have found a couple of leads on how can I then put it back into education and something that can be evaluated. But I still haven't really cracked
It's on the
it.
agenda.
Yeah, but yeah.
And so, Joe, I'll take, because your hand raised. Yeah.
I just wanted to give an example of how time can be a critical factor, because I looked at the learning lab here at Melbourne Uni as part of my study, and that was an environment designed for collaborative learning. It's got 5 sets of groups, settings for 8 people, and it was timetabled, students were timetabled in there for 1 hour. And what was evident through the observations there was that it was very difficult to actually do some really deep and meaningful, longitudinal, collaborative activities in an hour. By the time you introduce an activity and you allow for some latecomers and then people packing up, 5 minutes before the end of class, a lot of the data that I collected showed 3 minutes of activity, 5 minutes of activity.
Sorry, yes, please.
I think it's really interesting to talk about spatial silence, and we've kind of got this notion of temporal silence, but there's still a notion of thinking about learning environments that stop at the walls and stop at the doors. The reality for kids now is that in an age of one-to-one devices and ubiquitous access to the internet, I think that learning just continues. It's before and it's after school. And for schools, I think we have challenges. We're designing flexible, purposeful, engaging, agile, physical environments. And the question is, well, how well does our digital environment reflect that and mirror that, or is it really locked up and locked down? And I think the temporal thing is becoming increasingly more apparent as we sort of move into a modern learning pedagogies where so much stuff is online.
I think one of the problems that's sort of running through this discussion is the fact that the individual quality of the teacher, the pedagogy, swamps everything else. So, you can get a teacher teaching under a tree for 3 hours and I'll get far better outcomes than somebody who's got state-of-the-art whatever. So in trying to attribute the effects of various things, we've got to try and get ourselves underneath this thing which is swamping us. In terms of time, good teachers, expert teachers, which is the area that I work with, they will make any type of, whether it's 3 hours for a lesson or 10 minutes, they'll make it good. It's how they structure it, they interact with the students and all those sorts of things. So we need to be very careful about getting caught up on quantity rather than quality. And trying to basically control for this massive thing, which is the quality of the teaching. And one of the key things that drives that is obviously their professional learning. So this is some point I mentioned to Graham earlier on, that we need to really look at the role that teachers' professional learning plays in this. Because at the end of the day, the structural stuff, I'd say, does have a very strong effect.
So, or maybe a quick, we still have the time?
I'll start
when you want to stop. Sorry, yes, please.
Just a quick comment following on from that. Time is something that students involved in my research have commented on, and you'll hear about some of this later on. But time is a factor that they find very limited for them, not because of their teacher practice as a whole. They might have a very good teacher, but when they have a 73-minute class, there's 25 students, and they want to ask a question, they don't have time to get that question in because there are 24 other people who also have 2 minutes and however many seconds allocated to them. And time becomes a very important factor. And it's just part of being in the classroom.
One of the things that we found that is really, really powerful is the one-to-one conference, which is what we're sort of getting at.
Yep.
And there was one primary classroom where we were doing some research. We were interrupted as you do with the research, and this kid put a hand up and said, well, I still get my 5 minutes or whatever it was with the teacher. So this is a classroom where every student was timetabled 5 minutes, FaceTime with the teacher every week. It's only a couple of hours when you're aggregated. And it was done when the kids were doing it on the start. But the effect that they had really powerful.
unfortunately, sorry, I'm coming from a secondary background, and I'll see my science class twice a week for 73 minutes.
Yeah.
And,
No, that's the challenge in high schools. And I've talked about this. I'm an ex-high school teacher myself.
Yeah.
Talked about it with high school teachers. How do you meet that challenge of the one-to-one? It's a real problem.
And so I think you wanted to ask.
Yeah, not a question, just a comment. I think that all of these comments are all based around synchronous activities, of actually physically being in a physical space in the classroom, and maybe that's because a lot of people here seem to be secondary school teachers. But I think certainly within the tertiary sector, where we're moving a lot more into online education and the threat of the MOOC, as I mentioned earlier, I think that asynchronous activities and online education can seriously have an impact. So I don't know if anyone is going to be talking about virtual learning environments or whether this is seminars only focused on physical.
We'll hear from a couple more speakers before lunch, and I'll introduce them. Wes also reminded me that we have another event which we're currently organising, and there's some postcards around. It's on basically the same issue that is being discussed today, that concept of what works. So our sixth Talking Spaces conference, we've run them for the past 5 years, and we're silly enough to do it again. Will be on August 6th and 7th, and it will be the focus again is on learning environment evaluation in keeping with the current ARC project. So there's some postcards. Heather, where are you? They must be flying around somewhere. We'll follow it up with the detailed marketing campaign a bit later on. Stephen's left. That's unfortunate. I just wanted to make a point about professional learning. I think Chris is going to be looking at this